Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Aleš Nitzel. I'm a Slovene philosopher, podcaster, ex-columnist, or journalist. I'm currently a candidate for president of Republic of Slovenia. I'm not gonna become one because I'm also known as an ethno nationalist, or as some would put it, a fascist. Um, because of the word I used in the stream with Stefan Molyneux and got cancelled for that. My guest today is a guy I wanted to talk to for quite a while now. I'm very happy for the fact that we're gonna do it today. NORDLUX Bellator is his nickname, his pseudonym. He comes from Bulgaria, and he's a well-known Bulgarian ethno-nationalist. He's also known for the. Correct me if I'm wrong, if I understood you wrong, but you told me that you also discussed, you debated with the late daughter of Dugin.
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
so yeah, thanks for accepting my invitation, and I hope we're going to have such a pleasant chat and or debate as we had it before the stream. Welcome.
Pleasure is all mine, and I'm happy to talk with. I for a very long time I'm trying to contact people from the Balkans. Maybe with the exception of Turks and Serbs, I had a little bit of bias against them. But anyway, to be honest, for the first time, I'm talking with Slovenian nationalists. It is a kind of terra incognita for me. I studied with students from Slovenia for like 20 something years ago, and they were quite pleasant people, but this is the only thing that I know is from them basically.
Well,
And of, and of course I know some things from my Croatian friends, which of course they could be also biased, so this is.
my experiences with Bulgaria are I'm half Macedonian. My mother is
Mm,
Macedonian, so I could be biased because of that. Although I have a really a non-significant Macedonian identity. I don't identify, never identified as Macedonian. My mother never forced me into it, and even if she would, it seems that when the father comes from indigenous people, then the identity goes with the indigenous people, at least in Slovenia. But we have other experiences. For example, the majority of people that immigrate from ex-Yugoslavia to Slovenia, they I mean, culturally, ethnically, they seem to identify with their fathers always. The mothers
mm.
don't have anything with it. So this is one of my probable or hypothetic biases. Then I used to be a great fan of Christos Stoichkov uh, because I'm a fan of FC Barcelona. So I was a fan of Bulgarian national team. But I'm joking. I'm aware of the fact that the sports are probably the main platform for promoting civic nationalism, at least in Slovenia. So I'm not saying that sports is very important in such conversations.
I
And
would say
the
that I would say that most of the so-called Macedonian historical uh, personalities that are claimed to be Macedonian don't identify as Macedonians anyway, like Tsar Samuel. and things like that. They identified as Bulgarians. And from my mother's side, to be honest, from my mother's side, my family is coming from Skopje and from Ship. So yeah, but these people that came there, they never thought of themselves as Macedonians as mm, identity. They thought that they're Macedonians as, I suppose, Bavarians think of themselves in Germany, like Germans from Bavaria. So this is one of the things that actually pushed me to back in my childhood, pushed me to research Bulgarian history and to recognize our place in the world. Of course, back in the time I was more chauvinistic. Then I recognize the problems of this confrontation between the different nationalities on the Balkans and how the greater powers started to shape the realities in 18, 19, and 20th century. And generally speaking, it's interesting research for me, and then this pushed me to ethno or racial nationalism. I think that the most accurate term that I could use for myself is socialist nationalist or national socialist, not exactly third positionists, because a lot of people that I don't agree are calling themselves third positionists, which is kind of nothing term really. I mean, I don't think that I have something to do with Mexican, whatever they were called, or the Brazilian fascist like types, or even the Falangists in Spain. Maybe the European Falangist fascists are closer to a lot of these third positionist types. So this is what I
Uh,
can say for me. I mean, in real time, I was active for since my late teenage years in different nationalist organizations, mostly in the Bulgarian National Alliance and Union. Uh, the since growing older and I hope wiser, I have less and less time, and I decided to move my activities mostly online. The last thing that I did in real life, so to say, more significant at least, was in 2016. We organized the border patrols against the coming groups of racial invaders from Syria, Afghanistan, and Middle East. And this caused me kind of quite a lot of problems actually in real life. And, and I've decided that a lot of education propaganda is needed, and a lot of people actually don't understand what is going on the Balkans. And another thing that triggered me was that the narrative of the Russians is dominating the propaganda field of nationalism. A lot of these Anglo speakers, I mean, in the Anglosphere, they accept the propaganda narrative of the Russians, of the Serbs, and they don't have any understanding of history and anthropology, race, culture. So this is what pushed me to start making videos, so to say.
we were talking about this before our stream. So if you're some sort of a right winger or libertarian or classical liberal or whatever, as the majority of us that are now ethno nationalists of some sort, um, we the majority of us bought this narrative that the Democrats, the American Democrats, created this narrative of Russian collusion. Uh, so, but you are of the other opinion. You do think that, for example, the Trump's candidacy, his win, and all the podcasters that arose in 2015 or 2016 that semi helped Trump win the presidency of the United States of America, that they were at least somehow connected to Russia or Russian propaganda.
Yeah, because a lot of things happen in chronological order, so to say. Russia basically invaded Ukraine back in 2014. Interestingly enough, and I was talking about this even back in the time, but it's I was kind of surprised because you see, in 2012, in the different old forums of Bulgarian nationalists, there was very strong rumor that Russia will take Ukraine and they'll try to kind of invade or maybe influence Europe in a way. And I was rejecting this thing back in the time, 2012, and I was arguing with the guy that was spreading these rumors. He called this like Operation Gog and Magog, which again I said, well, they're using some Bible propaganda narrative. Most of these people, I don't know, uh, tinfoil hatters. Let's put it that way. And but he predicted, like 2 years before these Russian intervention in Ukraine, he predicted that they will try to take the eastern Ukraine, they will try to take Ukraine as a whole, and they will start to influence the politics of Europe. And he said that Europe is very dependent on Russia. After 10 years, I see most of the things that this guy, absolutely anonymous profile, by the way, most likely it was some kind of member of our secret service that they are still working with the Russians, to be honest, at least some elements of them. Most likely they were trying to spread these ideas and to manipulate the opinions. And then in 2014, as I said, Russia took Ukraine. They were rejecting any intervention. They were spreading the ideas that a bunch of miners decided to take arms against the Nazis and all the stuff, which is total bullshit. I mean, be honest, and these people continue to lie until recently, until 2022, when they started to when they started the second phase of the invasion. Well, their invasion is failing, but still the talking points of a lot of the talking heads in the West are still supporting Russia, and I don't see why they're supporting Russia. Russia is the same time of globalist empire, Judaic globalist empire as the West. They're just they're presenting just idea of globalism in slightly different package, but it's not attractive for anyone. Nobody is migrating to Russia. Nobody is going to work in Russia, and it doesn't work. What we need to understand is that we need the third way between globalist degeneration from the Russian side or globalist degeneration from the American side or the Western side. We need our own way, third way, so to say, or ethno nationalism or racial nationalism or European nationalism. I believe that I'm for Europe of the nations. I will quote Otto Scorzeni that said that Europe is like a rainbow of nations and they could shine together but separated. Otherwise, it will become just a big brown nothingness, right? So, definitely, I'm against this strange liberal degeneration that the West is proponing. I'm against this replacement of the population, which most likely pushed by the Judaic capitalists because they had their vengeance on the racial and cultural level against the European people. I'm against also against these imperialist Russian pan-Slavic pan everything that is mixing together thing. I don't think that Russia is also friendly towards any kind of racial nationalist or ethno nationalist. They are against that. They stated this many times. So they're not our guys. Americans also not our guys. We must build our networking and build our narrative. And I believe that in the coming years, our talking points will become mm, much more common, I would say. The only thing that I see as a problem is that these civic nationalists, these kosher nationalists, as I call them, are backed by Russia, and they're the most popular because people, you see, the normal Bulgarians, they don't like being poor and they don't like gay parades and they don't like corruption, but they don't realize that a lot of these things actually being poor, for example, is based on the corruption, is based on the basically leftovers from the communist regime that are still in power, in economically speaking, politically speaking. And I don't know how it's in Slovenia, but in Bulgaria, I cannot say that any of the most popular political players are independent. They're either related with the Russians, quite strongly the civic nationalists and the socialists are related with the Russians, or on the other side you have these centrist right wingers that are ex-communist, but they are related with the Americans. So I don't
Yeah,
like them both.
neither do I. But don't you think that civic nationalism comes also in many colors, and that or in many types, and some types come from America or from American propaganda, or would you say that this is a Russian propaganda in American package? For example, civic nationalism that's been purported through sports. For example, Slovene. I've been criticized by many last days when I said that it doesn't make sense that so many Serbs play for Slovene basketball national team. That I got nothing against Serbs. I have many Serb friends, and I'm aware of the fact that Serbian immigration is huge in Slovenia, and that you have to make some sort of place for these people to thrive and to live normal lives. And it just seems to be so that Serbs happen to be better at basketball and football than Slovenes, or at least more aggressive in it, in trying to achieve something in it. I'd say that it is this, but yeah, for example, this civic nationalism that's been purported through sports, the left wingers, the right wingers, the ex-communists becoming right wingers, the liberals, the progressives, they all go to this Slovene volleyball, basketball, football teams matches, and they all wave the flags and so forth. But it is civic nationalism, isn't it? What would you say? Which brand of the civic nationalism this is? And it obviously comes from America, where they would go to this basketball games as families, eat their popcorn, drink their Coca-Cola, and wave with their American flag, and listen to the American hymn. But they would they would just all be a weird mixture of whites cheering for black
I
sportsmen
will,
or
I will disagree. I will say that having experience from communist Bulgaria, it was the same. Basically, the state was funding sportsmen a lot of these sports, for example, wrestlers or boxers, were not ethnically Bulgarian. They were either Turkish or even Gypsies, and you must cheer them, even though they're not part of your culture, they're not part of your race, they're not part of your nation, actually, as I understand the term nation, not like these liberals that will say that if you are, I don't know, North African or Negro coming, and or some Muslim coming from the Middle East, and they come to Slovenia, and they are suddenly speaking somehow Slovenian, and they suddenly become Slovenian, right? The same was the same was in the time of communism. So basically, they were taking and it is weird system, which I would say that it's not even so fair as capitalism, even though capitalism is also not fair system. But generally speaking, there were more natural things in capitalism than in communism or or Russian type socialism, or call it as you want, because basically they're taking money from the products that a lot of educated people like my parents, being chemical engineers, were producing. They were producing quite a lot of value for the state, but they receive minuscule salaries, like minuscule. Like my father was a specific time of specialist in his sphere, and when he said what he received to his colleagues coming from Texaco back in the time, they was totally shocked. They thought that he receiving this salary for hour. That basically what happened was that they were taking this profit from a lot of people working quite hard, and they're giving to a bunch of sportsmen that were basically coming from a communist family, quite not very well educated guys, to be honest, and they were pushed to the scene. Yes, a lot of socialist countries were quite successful back in the time, especially on the Olympics, but this was the face of the regimes. This was the
Yeah.
propaganda of the regimes. Later, when the this system collapsed, seemingly the whole pyramid collapsed, these sportsmen, a lot of them were turned into the mafia. They, especially in Bulgaria and I believe in Serbia too, a lot of these people were turned into the mafia, and they became the iron fist of the communists that changed their faces and basically became capitalists. So this is what I think. And of course, behind these so-called changes were, especially in Bulgaria, were the Russians. They were coordinating. There were the people that were supporting our communists, and I suppose they were supporting to some extent the Serbs. So for me, it's obvious that Russia never change really. They still dominate the propaganda. They still manipulate our history, and that's why I don't like a lot of terms that we using presently. First of all, because they are not like historically accurate. Like Slavs, never in the first Bulgarian Empire records, which I believe the oldest records in Cyrillic or Cyrillic or whatever, never they use the term Slav. They use the term Slovene, which is, as we discussed before, it's basically people of the world. So most likely because they spoke similar languages to the other tribes like Croats and Serbs
Yeah.
and Swedes.
For example, we Slovenes we say Slovani.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Slovani is a different term than Slovenci. We call ourselves Slovenci.
mm-hmm,
And for example, Slovaks call them Slovinci, but the
mm-hmm,
upper term is Slovani, by which is meant the tribe that supposedly came to ex-Yugoslavia in 5th till 6th century.
mm-hmm.
Uh, but many, for example, Slovene ethno-nationalists deny this. They say a lot of our genetic material and cultural material and so forth was here way before, which is also ideologically understandable. Why you would tried to find something like that. Although I'm not an expert to be able to say if this is true or not, or um, but yeah. Um, I wanted to ask you because I mentioned semi-jokingly Hristo Stoichkov in the beginning, and you mentioned that you your predecessors were Bavarians. So I remember watching German TV.
No, no, no.
Uh,
You misunderstood me. You
I,
misunderstood me.
yeah.
My so basically from the two sides, I would say that I have from my mother's side there was they lived in Macedonia back in the 19th century, but they were Bulgarians. They thought of themselves as
Mhm.
Bulgarians. The other side of my family, they were like in Stara Planina, in the Balkan mountains, so to say, and they were in the present day Bulgaria. I have a little bit of northern German ancestry through one of my
Oh, okay.
grandmothers, like Saxon. But it is interesting what you mentioned by indigenous people before the Slovene or Slovene invasion or whatever.
Yeah,
Because when I took a genetic test, with the exception of this 7% that is Northern German or whatever, the rest is like, let's say they did in two parts, like big two parts is 60% is from these people that most likely came in the 6th 7th century from what is now Western Ukraine, and they found it Danube, Bulgaria, and they determined, like, I don't know, the company said Slavs, right, or Balkan Slavs or whatever, and 40% is basically indigenous population, like indigenous before that, and so call them Thracians, Illyrians, Eastern Romans, Christian population, whatever. This is what this is the building materials of
yeah.
most of
Of
the
okay.
Balkan people.
This is what I wanted to ask you because of I recollect listening to German journalists when watching the Bulgarian national team, or I must have watched the some documentary about Hristo Stoichkov or something,
Mm.
and the German journalist said, or reporter said, referred to him as a Zigeuner, as a gypsy.
Yeah.
Uh, uh, what would you for what is because you mentioned the gypsies before as a group, as a semi as a relatively large group in Bulgaria. What would you as one who identify as an ethnic Bulgarian, what would you say? What is a typical or paradigmatical ethnic Bulgarian on one side, and what would you call someone like Hristo Stoichko? Would you call him a gypsy too? And the next question is, how do you differ between between indigenous European people who do seem to be similar to, at least to some extent, to Semitic fixtures? Would you agree? They have,
Mm,
would you at least the dark hair and so forth? This is what we spoke before about the Dalmatians, for example, the Serbians, and the fact that many Bosniaks are red haired and blonde haired, as opposed to Serbs who are in a larger
darker,
extent
darker.
dark
Yeah.
haired, for example. And we spoke about it that we were taught in schools that those people in our territories, ex Yugoslavia and so forth, that are black because of the Turks and so forth and so forth. And it seems that it's a fixture of indigenous European people before the Indo-Europeans came, and
Yeah.
Indo-Europeans uh, are the Aryans in the Aryan theories, at
Mm.
least in the majority of them, the blonde-haired, aggressive, like Vikings or something like that. I don't know. This is the theory. This is the theory. This is the story.
To be honest, if you look at the recent reconstruction with facial features, pigmentation of the color of the hair and the eyes of Yamnaya, which a lot of people until recently accepted as the first Indo-European speakers, which they are not actually. There are other Indo-European speakers at that time, like Bell Beaker. They are actually dark-haired and dark-eyed, with some percentage of them being dark reddish-haired, not blonde. Maybe the blonde mutated from the reddish hair, or maybe even was presented before the Indo-European invasion in Europe. So a lot of the indigenous Indo-Europeans uh, actually maybe are closer to our looks than to what happened with. But it doesn't mean that we have the. Of course, in the north of Europe, they have more genes from them. But anthropologically speaking, at least phenotypically, they look closer to what I accept as Balkanian or Eastern European or something like that. And about the Semites, I think that the Semites started to mix quite early with the Greeks, and they started to look more like the Greeks than the original Semites. Like the Semites were a mixed group from the get-go. There were different depictions and descriptions of how the Jews, for example, look. There are strong variation between reddish hair in the more noble classes to very dark skin and curly hair to the average Semites. So my understanding is that there were mixed multitude of people from the get-go, and of course there were people with blonde hair in the upper classes of Egypt and Syria. This is also documented. Not to mention that the Babylonians, they venerated the blue eyes of a lot of their gods and goddesses, and not to mention that Sargon was described like a ruler over the dark-haired people, which means that if he's ruler over dark-haired people, there were also other people that were not dark-haired. There are so many things to be said about these place of contact between the different sub races and races. But generally speaking, I think that the dark haired element is definitely not coming from the Turks. It's coming from the indigenous population, which a lot of them are pre-Indo-European population. A lot of these people that are dark haired and even dark tanned, you can see in the Thracian tombs in the Thracian Valley in Bulgaria. And of course, it's a striking contrast with some of the descriptions of the Thracian ladies that were fair skinned with blue eyes and red hair. And a lot of people, for example, they are not described. For example, a lot of people think that the Slavs are looking like Nordic and things like that, but the Byzantium described them like more like darker haired or maybe slightly reddish dark haired types, not very tall. And this is coming from again from the propaganda narratives of the Russians. They're writing these fake pictures of the past, like these Slavs, all tall, blonde, blue-eyed, with white folk costumes that, by the way, invented in late 19th century for the Russians, things like that, and taken from other people, for example, from the Poles or Ukrainians or from Balkan people. And I had a conversation, for example, with a lady. This is my business. I am contacted with a lot of different tourists, and I had a conversation with a Russian lady back in the time, years back in the time, a Russian lady that is a leader of a folk group. They had some kind of festival in Burgas, different folk festivals, and I asked them because their costumes they doesn't look indigenous. Like we're talking about ladies, like supposedly peasant girls with the big crowns on their heads that are not practical. They're covered in very flamboyant colors like pink and blue and red, and they're all shining. And I don't see that this is indigenous colors. And she said, well, To be honest, this was created in the late 19th century by the ethnographs of the Russian Tsar. So so a lot of the narratives, a lot of the pictures of the past, as the Westerners understand the Slavs or the Slovenes, or call them as you want, are coming from the Russian propaganda. And this is important because, as you want, I had a conversation, for example, argument with Boers, people that are also suffering from genocide, uh, and they started to generally defend the Russians and said that we, being Slavs, we must be under the rulership of Russia. And say, why the fuck is that? I mean, it didn't work quite well in the past, and a lot of people uh, don't like the Russians, to be honest. And I don't want to be, and our history and culture are different from the history of culture of the Russians to some extent. Maybe I will say that Bulgarian Empire, the first Bulgarian Empire, was the source of a lot of history and culture for the Russian people, even though they don't recognize it. And of course, these Boers didn't know anything about that, and they started to say that we on the Balkans are actually not Slavs anymore because we're mixed and things like that, and we don't look like Russians, and the Russians must be the original Slavs, which also is not true. But this is how they're creating this narrative. And we're going to one of the topics that you mentioned before the stream about Pan-Slavism. Well, the source of Pan-Slavism is actually a Croatian monk that wrote the history of the kingdom of the Slovenes, right? And he described the history of different people. And this book, or at least part of the translation, were part of Historia Sloveno-Bulgarskaya, which is part of the Bulgarian Renaissance and national revival and the national movement against the Turks back in the time. But uh, this idea was adopted in the 18th century by the Russian Tsars, by the Russian emperors, and they, because coincidentally they were on the rise and they had very strong geopolitical need of the Balkans. They need to capture Balkans. They need to capture Constantinople. They need their navy. Or military navy and their trading ships to be freely in the Mediterranean Sea. So they need to convince the Balkan population that the Russian Empire is their friend, they're Orthodox and Slavic brothers, and basically the Russian Tsar is, in Bulgaria they use the term Dyadu Ivan, or Grandpa Ivan, is their friend, their bigger brother, so to say, or something like that. And this narrative is still used to this day. And in reality, most of the times when Bulgarians somehow try to intervene with the Russians, it was with bad effects on the Bulgarian side. And your, let's say, Serbian friends, I think that their national identity is also quite a lot of shaped by Russian propaganda, to be honest. And I had these conversations or arguments with Serbs, and they claimed that all the Slavs on the Balkans were Serbs, and these evil Mongols or Tatars came, the Bulgarians, and they somehow Bulgarized them and things like that. But all the Slavs on
Yeah.
the Balkans were Serbs.
It's funny, you have this in every nation state in ex-Yugoslavia, also in Slovenia, with their a little bit different stories and narratives and so-called findings and so forth. We have our theorists here in Slovenia too who say that the people who the world calls Slavs and we call Slovani and Serbs
Mhm.
call Slaveni, that these people are basically Slovenes So the
Mm,
implication is that all the ex-Yugoslavian countries, the Croats, the Serbs, the Macedonians, and so forth, were basically Slovenes in the past. But it's on such shaky grounds. What do you think about these extrapolations into the prehistoric times, or not even into the prehistoric times, but into the antique, for example, Rome from antiquity, or Greece from antiquity, and so forth, because it seems that, for example, the genetic facts about Slovenia are: the third of Slovenes have R1A haplogroup.
mm.
The fourth of Slovenes have R1B haplogroup. And some people say that the third of the nation having a haplogroup is a really large percentage, but nevertheless, you cannot extrapolate into antiquity uh, out of the third of population, unless you're just basically saying, unless you're just trying to say that the theory of Slavic immigration in the fifth and sixth century is not real, which is, it seems that it is not real, or at least it's not real. It's not true that Slavs or only Slavs. It seems that people have been here in this territory way before that. That is true, but to extrapolate into the antiquity out of the data of third of population having one haplogroup is it's too much, don't you think?
Well, I my haplogroup, for example, is R1A1, right? So I'm, as I said, they consider me Slavic, but
Mm.
haplogroup is just a small percentage of the genome, right? So we are all our forefathers. We are these people, whatever Slovenes or whatever they're called. I'm Bulgarians and whatever Scythians or Goths or whatever they were called, but also this Asian population that, to be honest, they were melted in the Roman Empire. So we cannot say, oh, there were Thracians. This is quite strong in Bulgaria. They're pushing this Asian Thracian narrative that they're, oh, Thracians, things like that. We cannot say that they're Illyrians, maybe in Slovenia or in Croatia. They said that it's all Illyrians, things like that. We are all of these people. We are continuation of all these ancient lines of people. But I would say that this is the blood, this is the, or I must say, this is the soil. We receive our genes, but the spirit is from our founding fathers, with the people that created our nations at some point in history. We receive language, we receive ideology, we receive religion, we receive all these elements of the folk culture, costumes, food, songs, and these make us nations. This is what this is what builds us, and this is for thousands of years. Like, it's not only genes. You can say that you can found, let's say, if a negro in central Africa, let's say, have a German forefather, and he has R1B1, and the negro
Yeah.
will receive this haplogroup. He's not German, he's something in between. But if you are put in Germany, in the present liberal propaganda, you say, oh, he's speaking German. Let's say that he's speaking German, so he's German. But the same is in Russia. If you're what Putin said, he's against caveman nationalism. He's against this narrative, Russia за русские, Russia for the Russians. He said that this is destructive for the Russians, because for them the Russia is empire, which is true, by the way. It's not an ethno state. So for them, they cannot build an ethno state without losing the empire. The same for the Serbs. The Yugoslavia was built on the imperial Serbian narrative. and they created a fake nation as Macedonia. I'm sorry, but this is quite obvious. It's a fake nation as Macedonia, built on false narratives, and they built these Slavic, Yugoslavian identity or something. But in reality, there are differences. Even the similarity are present. There are a lot of differences, and there was a, by the way, chance, and there was the greater plan of Yugoslavia to include also Bulgaria, and this didn't happen because
Yep.
of the split between Tito and Stalin. But actually, they were preparing this, and I think that Tito was not a big fan of the idea because Bulgaria was a quite big nation. This will counter his group or his party, and basically Stalin was pushing that because he wanted to balance the Serbian Tito fraction. This is what I try to fight. And there was a lot of persecution of Bulgarians in Macedonia at that time, and a lot of people actually were either killed or sent to Goli Otok in the Adriatic Sea. And generally speaking, this look what the present day Macedonian thinks of their history. They believe, when I was 2 years ago with my girlfriend and her father to a short tourist trip in Macedonia and Albania. Skopje was like mind-blowing, stupid statues. Uh, it is like these ancient statues. There are some ancient Macedonians that spoke Hellenic language, or it's obvious fact.
Yeah.
Uh, then they somehow turn to be these special Slavs that are neither Serbs but neither Bulgarians, but their language is obviously from the Bulgarian group. It's obvious.
For
And
example, I can tell you about my mother. For example, my mother, if you tell her, I used to provoke my mother just for fun. I know I'm a bad guy, but I would I would tell her you are basically Bulgarian, and she would get mad, and she would get mad, and I and I would say to her, you're basically Greek, and she would get mad. But if I would say to her, uh, you're basically a Serb, uh, she would not get mad. She would say, "Yeah, we are probably South Serbs or something." But uh, I'm not sure. I'm not. My mother used to say that when Bulgaria uh, in the middle of the Second World War, you Bulgarians were in charge of the territory of Macedonia, and her mother
they were they were
would,
genocided by the evil fascists, right?
yeah,
I
yeah,
know the
but
story. I know the stories.
I never heard the story of any slaughter or anything, but the meanest story about Bulgarians is about her mother's teacher that would say to her something like "Speak Bulgarian," and her mother would say to her teacher, "I won't. I'm a Macedonian," for example. So it the Macedonian identity, at least I can say this from my own experience, from my own family, it predates 45. So, but as I'm aware
I,
of the power of the
I,
propaganda, I would like to know, when did this propaganda
are you sure?
start?
Because I know
Yeah,
Ottoman census from the beginning of 20th century where no Macedonians were mentioned, but they were mentioned like 1.5 million Bulgarians in what is now Macedonia, and they
I
never
can.
mentioned Serbs, by the way. There were Albanians, there were
I'm not
Gypsies, there were
aware. Yeah, basically, ethno Macedonians hate Greeks, the Bulgarians, and Kosovo, Sorry, Kosovo Albanians. This is what they do. This is the part of their identity. So from my family, I have experience. I can say quite sure that this identity predates 4045. But I'm also sure that, as it is with all identities, this is a part of some sort of propaganda. But I'm not sure when it started. For example, what's interesting, that this is really interesting because we were taught that communism in ex-Yugoslavia wanted to create this melting pot of this all Slavic nations or tribes or whatever. But uh, it is interesting that the so-called nationalistic Macedonian journal or something. I don't remember what it was called, but it was supposed to be nationalistic Macedonian journal, which is, I'm sure there were Jews behind it. But it started um, in before communistic Yugoslavia. It was in Serbian language, but after 45 in communistic Yugoslavia, it started in Macedonian language. This is really interesting for me because it would imply, at least on first hand, that they tried to promote Macedonian civic nationalism in in Yugoslavia that was supposedly purporting to melt all the nations. This is really what would your comment on it be?
My comment was that Tito promote. So basically, before Tito, the Serbian propaganda was that the Macedonians were pravi Serbi, like real Serbs that were found. But you see, the problem with that is that if you a random, let's say a random guy that the Macedonian claims, the modern Macedonian claims it was Macedonian. Let's say Ioan Cucuzeo. That is just a random. And I'm typing
Um,
John Cucuzelis. This is in the Orthodox world. He is a famous guy. He wrote basically a lot of Orthodox chants that were used in the Russian, Albanian, Greek church, things like that. And happened to be born in what is now Macedonian, and his one of his creations were dedicated to his mother, and it is called one Bulgarian lady. This is a known fact, but the Macedonians say, oh, he didn't know that he's Macedonian. Then we're going to a Tsar Samuel, and it is known fact that he's Bulgarian Tsar. It is mentioned, the Byzantines mentioned that he's Bulgarian Tsar. He said the Tsar, the ruler of the Bulgarians, and things like that. But now the Macedonians said that this is the problem. You see, I don't have a problem with Macedonians claiming a new identity. They said, oh, we have new identity. We started to be a nation in 1945, right? No problem with that. They could say that they're Martians. I don't care. The problem is the stealing of a cultural history and identity back in the time, because this is cutting the achievements of Bulgarian Empire, the Bulgarian people, which is kind of not fair. I think that we don't need to fake history contrary to the Serbs that claiming quite ridiculous things like I don't know, the Queen Elizabeth was Serbian and Churchill was Serbian, and I don't know what is Serbian or Macedonians, that Alexander the Great was Macedonian or Macedonian as they understand it. It's ridiculous claims. I know that Simeon the Great or Simon the Great was the first guy that used the title Tsar. It is a Bulgarian title that was adopted. I know that Kliment Ohridsky created the Cyrillic alphabet with a lot of other students there in the two literary schools. I know that Samuil was Bulgarian Tsar. It is known, it is written in the scriptures. I know that Goce Delchev was Bulgarian, he wrote it in the letters. I know that if Vanchi Mikhailov said that he's Bulgarian, and he said it in video. Basically, he said that Macedonia without Bulgarians to be burned by fire or something in those lines.
But
So
wouldn't you say I have to? I'm not doing this because of my mother's Macedonian. I don't care about Macedonia. Um, I care about my mother, but not Macedonia.
yeah, 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 of
So
course, of course.
yeah. But couldn't it be that people back in the days used to identify with the empire, not with their tribe, and the empires are obviously or have always been multi-tribal. So, for example, Slovenes were in Austro-Hungarian Empire, and
Mm,
before the spring of nations, so-called, at least we were taught like that.
this
Um,
is the if we're
uh,
talking about this, it's very easy. For example, when I go to Macedonia, it's very easy to for me to understand them, and even if their language is based on basically southwestern dialect mixed with a lot of Serbisms. Right now it's a lot of Serbism. For example, they're using the term puter, which they never used back in the time, and this is also recorded by another people called Miladinov brothers. They back in the time they used more clean Bulgarian than what they're using now, and a lot of Macedonians they cannot understand the what these Miladinov brothers were using in 19th century because it was not so full with Serbisms and so full of fake
that
construction.
that that is
But
that that is true, but I can tell you, I never taught Macedonian language, and
mm,
I didn't hear my mother very much speaking Macedonian. I heard her, but not much. But I can understand Macedonian because I understand Serbian, but I cannot understand Bulgarian. How would you explain that?
I can understand to some degree Croatian, let's say, and I
Yeah, but,
definitely could understand Russian without being Russian, and but on the other hand, I cannot understand Ukrainian.
yeah,
So and I
for
explain
example, yeah,
I can
maybe I
explain.
don't hear. Yeah, maybe I don't hear very well, or maybe I don't have. Mm, I don't hear the specifics very good of the language. We were taught in schools that Slavic languages are all basically the same to the extent that we could all understand each other. But for example, I cannot understand Czechs. I cannot understand the Slovaks. I, I cannot Poles. The Poles. I cannot
Absolutely, yeah,
understand. I mean,
of course.
some words, but nothing. Yet I can understand Macedonian because I understand Serbian.
So yeah, that I could say that Macedonian say to understand is one thing, but to understand everything is different. So the
I would
Macedonians,
say
for
it's a
example,
mixture. I would say it's a mixture between Bulgarian and
let, let,
Serbian language.
let's see let's put it that way. For example, Macedonians are using the term for lex nogi. The term for lex nogi were used also in the eastern dialects of Bulgaria, but it was replaced by other words, kraka. But because I know old Bulgarian or old Church Slavonic a little bit, not I'm not a great specialist in that. I know what type of words. So basically, the Eastern dialects and the Western dialects they were much closer together back in the 19th century. But the Eastern dialects, which are now dominant in Bulgaria, they were passing through a different type of development. They were influenced through a National Academy of Science. So, to be honest, the Russophiles, especially after 1945, they started to push Bulgarian to sound more and more like Russian, and they changed the alphabet to simplify the alphabet, things like that. To be honest, back in the time, the alphabet were closer to what is now the Ukrainian alphabet, and there were a lot of things to be said in that matter. But generally speaking, a lot of these words and it's basically my grandmother is speaking, was speaking. She's speaking also Eastern. Uh, what is now modern Bulgarian, but she also could speak dialect of Macedonian, and she never said, "Well, this is like different language or something," just dialect. And just I would say things, because you said tribes, but well, linguistically, Bulgarians and Macedonians are in one group because of the some constrictions, and Serbs, Croatians, and Slovenes are in another linguistic group. They are these split in the Balkans. So and of course, not to mention the Eastern Slavs and the Central Slavs. I also cannot understand Poles and Czechs. I mean, they could understand each other, I suppose, but this is what it is. And about
You
Russians,
you asked me what I think about what do I think about Croatian nationalism before. So
mhm,
we're gonna go to that. I just wanted to ask you another question. I just remembered. Uh, Slovene nationalism is obviously civic nationalism. I mean mainstream nationalism. The only nationalism that is allowed is civic nationalism. Even uh, Janez Janša, the former prime minister, he's a chairman of this SDS, which is a party that presented itself as a right wing, as pro Slovenian, as patriots. So they named him. He said in an interview quite clearly that he's not a nationalist, he's a patriot. And he uses all this symbolism. He goes into mountains and waves with the flags and so forth, which is obviously propaganda of this civic nationalism, patriotism, and so forth, which is against ethno nationalism. So, but what's correlated with that is also this weird friendship. So we say Shiptarophilia. Uh, by Shiptari, we mean Kosovo Albanians. They call
mhm,
themselves Shiptari. A
yeah,
weird Shiptarophilia amongst this mainstream Slovene right wingers and weird Serbophobia amongst this mainstream right wingers, which, in my opinion, shows quite clearly that the so-called Slovene nationalism has been built by Atlanticistic institutions, by NATO, EU, CIA, and so forth. It would be quite a wild hypothesis to say that Russians played 4D chess and they were the ones that created Slovene nationalism, which is, as I said, not ethno nationalism. It loves the Kosovo Albanians, hates Serbs, hate Russia. It's obviously NATO created, for example.
mm.
Wouldn't
Are you
it be
sure?
possible? Wouldn't it be possible that all the ethno, because your hypothesis is that civic nationalism around the Europe has been created by Russians, when it's a clear experience of my own that the civic nationalism in Slovenia, for example, has been created by NATO, CIA, or
Are,
America.
are you sure? Because I
I'm
also don't
quite
like.
sure. I'm quite
I
sure.
also don't like Serbs, and this is based on my knowledge of history. They were
And
committing
but is
genocides.
it?
They
But is
were.
it? But is it? And to which extent do you can we? I know that the Russians do propaganda too. I'm not denying that, and I'm not denying the fact that the optimal thing for us Europeans, for ethno nationalists, would be a strong Europe of nations. We agree on that, and we agree on the fact that to the extent Judeo-American, Judeo-Russia are our foes, both. We agree to this, but it's from my experience, the Yugoslavia has probably has been the kingdom of Yugoslavia, which was the first thing, was obviously built on propaganda of Slovene civic nationalism. And you go from the Slovene civic nationalism, so language and so forth, to Pan-Slavism, and that's how you come to the idea that Slovenes are better off in a kingdom or in a republic with Serbs, Croats, Montenegrins, Macedonians, and so forth and so forth. This is how the Austro-Hungarian Empire was wrecked on this kind of ideas of civic nationalism in the ex-Yugoslavia, and afterwards, this is how Yugoslavia was built. I'm only talking about facts, and in the 90s, in the beginning of the 90s, it is quite obvious how Slovene, Croatian, Serbian, Montenegrin, and so forth nationalisms have been built to wreck Yugoslavia. I'm not for it. I'm not against it. I used to be for it. I used to be a this Atlanticistic Slovene ethno nationalist, whatever that meant. I was obviously uh, confused and obviously misinformed and so forth. But it's quite obvious that it's been created on Shqiptarophilia, Serbophobia, Russophobia, and an extreme love for Atlanticistic institutions. This is what Slovene civic nationalism has been built. These are the facts. You cannot deny this.
I don't know. I don't know. It's you're the only source of information about what is the nationalism is in Slovenia. I can tell you why I prefer Albanians. It's coming from my historical knowledge. Since I told you that I had relatives coming from what is now Macedonia, there were also members of Imerio or Vemerio, the Bulgarian, or if you especially Mace- pro-Macedonian revolutionary organization, and there were sources writing that there were a lot of Albanians joining the fights with Bulgarians. They said Bulgarians, not Macedonians. I don't know why, against Serbs, Greeks, and Turks. So basically, I think that Albanians somehow were more nationalistic, and they joined Bulgarians maybe because they saw as more reliable allies. And it is interesting that back in the time, the Macedonians or Bulgarians in Macedonia didn't have many problems with Albanians, but right now, because of this weird propaganda of the identity, they had a lot of problems with Macedonians, with Albanians, basically in Macedonia. And
I remember when I was 9, I had this football player. I played football with this Kosovo Albanian who is now living in Slovenia, and we're okay and so forth. But
mm,
his name was Ahmedin something, whatever.
mhm,
And
mhm,
we went to play a soccer uh, in Austria or something, and we were in the car. My father my mother, me, and this guy Ahmedin, and this was in the 91 or 92 or something like that. And my mother asked Ahmedin, where are you going? Where are you going on your vacation? And Ahmedin told her, uh, to Albania, home, home to Albania. And oh, really? And where is it that in Albania that you're going to? And he said, Pristina.
Hmm.
Pristina, Pristina is Kosovo, and
Yeah, yeah,
Kosovo didn't get independent until 2009, I believe, or 2008 or 7 or something like that, because
yeah,
we used to
yeah,
have this right wing Slovene government that immediately went um, to go with the independent Kosovo, uh, which was really weird, creating a second Albania. And my experience, I could be biased. I mean subconsciously, because my mother my mother somehow propagandized hatred toward Albanians into me. But the main demographic problem is in Slovenia connected with right-wing governments that were supposed to be nationalistic and that are against illegal immigration and so forth, is that they keep getting Kosovo Albanians, more and more and more, and Kosovo Albanian immigrants into Slovenia every year every year on. And the numbers that came into Slovenia during the right wing governments, and they admit it. And when you ask them why couldn't you do something else? Why are you bringing so many Bosniaks, so many Kosovo Albanians here? They have 4 to 10 children. They have more children than we do. Yeah, it's inevitable. Our economy needs them because
mhm,
Slovenia
mhm.
don't want to work for so such gauges and so forth. This is these are the arguments they have, and when you go deeper into conversations, they are trying to promote this weird theory that Slovenes and that Kosovo Albanians are the same people. They are also very I don't know. Slovenes always identified as at least semi as Germans. You know,
Mhm,
very
mhm.
Deutsche Tugend,
Yeah, 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 yeah.
work very hard. This quasi Protestant ethics and so forth, and they're trying to promote this narrative that Albanians are also like that. Although, I mean, they work a lot, they work hard, but they are a tribe. They are an economic tribe, similarly as the Jews are. For example, they work and they gather, they pile the money inside their families, and they're obviously privileged in Slovenia. For example, during the COVID, they were the only. They have all this burak džinice. You know what burek is? They sell bureks, and
Yeah, yeah,
they
yeah. I know what is burek or burek in Bulgaria. We call it banica. I know what you mean. Yeah, yeah.
uh,
It, it's
yeah, and
I see. So basically, I see. I understand what you mean. It's whatever is the migration that is like Slovenia. How what is the population of Slovenes in Slovenia?
yeah, we are not allowed anymore, neither by right wing governments nor by left wing governments, to count ourselves. For example, the last time we could count ourselves was in 2001 or some. But even then, even in 2000, in 2001, you couldn't differentiate between the Slovenes in the sense of having citizenship and ethnic Slovenes. It could be that many of them were Serbs, Kosovo Albanians, Bosniaks, Macedonians that identified as Slovenes, but were basically from another tribe. So I don't know. My wild speculation is that we have 2.1 million inhabitants in Slovenia. I'm not sure if there's million and a half Slovenes. I mean, it's probably million, near to million Slovenes in my opinion. In the cities, you don't see Slovenes anymore. You don't hear the Slovene language anymore.
Mhm. So I understand it's a problem of ethnic replacement, but I will also say that a lot of Bosniaks and a lot of Albanians, like anthropologically speaking, not culturally speaking, not ethnically speaking, are Europeans. I mean, you cannot deny that. Now, the
Yeah.
problem that I can see, I'm not for replacement of the Slovenian people, and I'm not replaced. For example, I have friends from Denmark, and they said, "Oh, these Poles are coming here to work," and I said, "Well." If it's okay, if it's like 100,000 Poles working in Denmark, you can melt them and you can make them Danes, and it can work. Of course, they had some kind of purity complexes, things like that. Say, well, it
Uh,
happened in the past. It happened in the past. Nordic people migrated to the east. They were melted. People from the Balkans migrated to Germany. They were melted. This is a normal thing amongst the in small quantity. You have established culture and language, and you adopt and you melt these people, and there is no problem. This is what I have a positive in a European diversity, so to say. But total replacement of the population, I disagree. And of course, you
yeah.
could say
Th- This, this,
about
this is
Islam
my
in
point. My
not
point as a
yeah, yeah.
candidate for a president of Slovenia is that Slovenes have to have some sort of they have to be sovereign. They have to be independent
Mm,
about their immigration. We have to be able to say, okay, 75%, 80% have to be ethnic Slovenes, and the others can be immigrants. When this ratio comes down, we have to stop the immigration. This seems that this here's to me as something normal, as something that every nation state, including Israel, uh, should should have the right to do for example, and this is not even something that's considered normal nowadays, for example, but yet the left wing, this left wing argument, stupid argument, he's trying to make to ethnically cleanse Slovenia, to only have clean Slovenes and so forth and so forth, whatever that means. I never use this word clean Slovenes, but what apropos genetics, it has you have to have some criteria. For example, that the majority of people um, that constitute Slovene nation have via both parents at least couple of generations of predecessors that have graves on this territory. Wouldn't you say so? That this I'm not aware. I don't know myself how many generations. I'm not saying that I have an answer, but I would at least like to have conversations about this. You know what I mean?
I understand your point, and I agree with you. The problem is, so basically, do you have problem with Albanian mafia, or with some kind of strange, more radical Islamic groups through the Bosniaks and things like that?
Not yet, although some people that come from smaller towns, they say they do have problems with even if it's not mafia de facto. whatever that means. What is de facto mafia? But these people behave. They do things in tribes, in groups, and Slovenes have been brainwashed into being individuals. We're all individual. We're living in as individuals. We don't have bunch of friends that are always prepared to fight for themselves, like the Albanian guys are. For example, there are a couple of Slovene towns now that it's obviously the majority of Albanians there, and the schools, they need Albanian translators, Albanian teachers. This is against Slovene constitutions. There are only three formal languages in Slovenia. It's Hungarian and Italian minority, so Hungarian language and Italian language in Prekmurje and Primorje, which are the areas where these people live. But the only real formal language is Slovene. But nowadays in Kran, for example, or in Celje, the Albanians are trying to promote this idea that they deserve, that they have right to be taught in Albanian language in Slovenia. And this
I
is
see.
ludicrous.
I see.
Yes.
I see. I see. So, what I was trying to say that maybe I will bring you to discussion with Albanian nationalists, because basically, I know some guys, and they're quite pleasant, quite pleasant guys. As said, I not being a civic Slovenian nationalist, but I'm more sympathetic to the Albanians than to the Serbs, because history, when you say that you are brat or brati or whatever, and you're genociding and purging population and creating false identities and stealing history, it doesn't it's not very good in my book. And not to mention that they are support of imperialist Russian expansion. That's totally ludicrous. But I understand also your points, and of course the perfect world will be then when they work in certain period of years. Let's say they receive some uh, contemporary citizenship or working visa for 10, or I don't know, 5-10 years. They work, and they'll be sent back to Albania. Let's say this is maybe some kind of compromise, and this is maybe how the things will be, because they will be better situated in Albania culturally, linguistically, and things like that than in Slovenia. The same
But
is
I
for
heard
the.
this. Did you hear this thing? I don't know if you heard this when you discussed Albanian nationalists, but I heard that many Albanian nationalists don't like Kosovo Albanians.
Mhm.
It's not obvious. It's not a priori stance for Albanian nationalists to support Kosovo Albania, second Albania, and so forth. Although it would be natural if Albanian nationalists would think imperialistically. For if you know what I mean. For example, if I would be a Slovene imperialist, ethno nationalist, it would be natural for me to be happy if we would be able uh, to get the territory of Croats and Austrians and the Hungarians and so forth. If we would be able to get a little bit more of our in Hitlerian words. Um, um, I
Living
forgot
space,
the word. Yeah,
Lebensraum.
yeah, Lebensraum. Yeah,
Yeah.
of
Mhm.
course. If it, so, it would be natural for Albanian ethno nationalists, if thinking imperialistically, to support Kosovo Albanians, but it's not. I heard that it's not a priori stance. What did you hear about this?
I well, it's complicated. As I said, genetically, in this map, I will try to bring at some point. A Albanian guy, as I said, gave me this genetic map of the Balkans, and in the middle was Bulgaria, and they were compared to the other population. And as I said before, the Kosovo Albanians were in striking difference from the genetically speaking with the main Albania. Main Albania was something like 75.5% similar to Bulgarians, if Bulgarians is at the point, of course. Serbs was 76% similar, and the Kosovo Albanians was something like 57% similar. So they're kind of different, and this means that they're genetically different from the main Albania for some reason. I don't know why. Uh, Maybe this is the reason. Maybe I have some not a first source information for the situation in Albania, but take in mind that Albanian government could be also under pressure not to unify it with Kosovo. I think that the empires that are in charge also have how to say they could split the different countries in very small parts, and they could always use it against us. Now, I would also support, and this I think if this will cause a stability and peace unification between Albania and Kosovo, because obviously the majority of the people in Kosovo are Albanians, and if these bring peace and stability, I'm full for it, because what is coming right now is a possibility of a coming new Balkan war in the future for some reason, and that will be pushed from one side from the Russians and from the other side from America, maybe, and this wouldn't be beneficial for anyone, I believe. Not to mention that other powers are also eventually will come to the Balkans. I'm hearing quite weird rumors about Chinese military bases in Serbia in the future. This is only a rumor, of course, could be propaganda. But generally speaking, we must start to understand who are the threats for the stability of the Balkans. And one of the threats, of course, are the Turks. At least this is from my perspective. The other threats, of course, the Russians that want to expand on the Balkans in one way or another, directly or indirectly. And of course, these I believe that the Central European countries as a whole, they prefer to have like a stable trading route right now, and they prefer peace on the Balkans. So these could be used like as a tool, even though they don't have also quite independent politics. And America is also big proponent of certain Albanian factions. What I found, but also I must say that this is what one of the Albanian guys that I communicate. The first victims of these factions, of these Albanian mafia types, were not the Swedes or the Slovaks or the Slovenians. The first victims were the Albanian people. This is the same like Bulgarian mafia. Before expanding outside of the borders of Bulgaria, the first victims were the Bulgarian people. So these people, I think, from my conversations with Albanians, is that these people, a lot of them had old communist relations. They also are pushed by certain intelligence services, both Eastern and Western. And that's why I was asking if these people were causing problems when in Slovenia,
Yeah,
because
I this is a puzzle I wanted to discuss with you about. You asked me before the stream about the Croatian nationalism, and I I have no beef with Croatians as many Slovenes do. Many Slovenes, at the left-leaning Slovenes, were for a long time Serbophiles, and from this Serbophilia they went into Croatophobia. Although this kind of Croatophobia and Serbophilia is a communistic paradigm, sort of say a Jewish created antagonism between Serbs and Croats, in my opinion. But okay, I have this problem with I think that Croatian nationalism has this problem. The nationalism that's been mm, that's been presented in Croatia through their legendary president Franjo Tudjman. Uh, HDZ is their main party that is supposedly pro Croatian, pro church, pro tradition, pro conservative, and so forth. And is basically a internationally led right wing as it is in Slovenia. But what I wanted to say is that yeah, the you probably heard about Ustaše, the men
Yeah,
of
yeah, yeah.
and the NDH and so forth. They were too many Jews were in that movement, and from the beginning on, the Croatian nationalism has had too many Jews in their nationalistic movements. And I had a guy, an old guy, an academic in that lives in Maribor, but is a Croatian Jew that lived and worked with Franjo Tudjman. And Franjo Tudjman is, in my opinion, also a Jew. Uh, because he has this surname Tudjman. You know what a Tudjman means? It's a foreigner, basically.
Mhm,
His
mhm.
surname is foreigner, uh, and he also has these features. He looks like that guy, that Jewish guy, Goldblum, Jeff Goldblum, I believe. When he was young, he looked the same as Jeff Goldblum and so forth. But it doesn't matter. This Jewish guy from Maribor said to me that the Jews were basically the creators of Croatian nationalism, and the Tudjman was the one that usurped and monopolized this Croatian nationalism. So basically, the Croats were their nationalism is Jewish created, and it's a civic nationalism as it shows nowadays. Although they were considered fascists, ethno nationalists during the war, when they supposedly ethnically cleansed Serbs that lived in Croatia for centuries or something like that. Whatever. But it was not from the ethnic nationalist point as it was purported and as we were taught about, as it shows
But
today. It
wait,
was
wait, wait
Jewish
a second. Wait a
nationalism.
second.
Uh,
This suggests that there are no difference between Serbs and Croats, or what? Because
yeah,
it's not. It's
here.
not true. It's not true. It's basically there were historical sources that are as old as, let's say, 10th century. Again, going back to sources of first Bulgarian Empire that make a quite difference between Croats and Serbs. Like and to be honest, the only areas that were supposedly Serbian or ethnic Serbian in that period was Ras or Rash or Rashka, which is a very small proportion of what is now the territory of Serbia. So my
Yeah,
suspicion is that the Serbs quite expansionistically and opportunistically expanded and used the big confrontation between the Byzantine Bulgarian Empire and the Hungarians that weakened, of course, at some point the Croats and things like that. So this is my understanding is that the Croats had the historical arguments that they're different than the Serbs, even though the languages could be, as I said, Slovenian, Serbian, and Montenegrin, which is a
yeah.
newcomer, of
This this
course.
is this is
Uh,
this is what I wanted to say. Their nationalism is civic, although you have this story coming from the people and maybe sincere nationalists. I don't say that they don't have sincere ethno nationalists. I don't say that they don't have a point of them being different from Serbs ethnically and so forth. I'm saying this about mainstream right wing patriotic nationalist politics or ideology. But ethnically, they also have problems because ethnically and language wise, the northern Croatians are Slovenes. They cannot deny this. They cannot deny this. They talk like Slovenes. They are more similar to Slovenes phenotypically, behavior wise, temperament wise. It's undeniable. So the Croatian nation, I'm not denying that there's a nation, but you have to redefine it, and you have to define it really specifically. They do have their national pride, obviously, and if you would ask some northern Croatian, what is he, a Croatian or Slovene, he would probably say Croatian, at least when their national soccer team is doing great. Their nationalism has also been lately, for the last 10 years or 20 years, purported or promoted through sports, lately through soccer or through football, the most. And yeah, they have this pride connected to this, similarly as Slovenes have the pride connected to sports. But beyond the sports, the mainstream politics, the mainstream ideology, the mainstream nationalism in Croatia is also civic nationalism. But even if there were ethnic nationalism, they would have problems, but not the majority of their problems would not be them differentiating themselves with Serbs, but with the Slovenes. As I said, language wise and ethnically, northern Croatians are much more similar to Slovenes.
As I said, I'm not specialist in the history of the Ustasha movement, but I would say that, from my understanding, is that they were quite aggressive. They built their idea of state quite successfully for some period of time. On identity, yes, of course, it's around the Catholic Church, but also I would say that Ante Pavelic was incorporating the Muslims, or right now you will say Bosniaks, into the Croatian state. And right now I also talk with the Bosniak nationalists, which are also very nice people, not non-Muslim Bosniaks, to be honest, but they don't want to identify with Croats anymore, even though there were statements back in the time of Muslims that were identifying with Croats. So my understanding is that this identity also is kind of created later, maybe on the basis of, I don't know. Maybe it's better than the Macedonian identity because it's totally like recent thing. Maybe the Bosniak identity was created in the medieval century. There was a split maybe there. But what I can say is that the Croatian nationalism is like better defined than the Serbo nationalism. It's less pan-Slavic, which I like. It's less imperialistic, and is based on more historical arguments that also could be proved. Of course, I will leave the thing with Nikola Tesla on side because it's a point of discussion there, things like that. But generally speaking, I cannot say about Slovenians. They will say, my Croatian friends will say that the Slovenians are like Croats. Like, how? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean there are no. If you go and see the Bible of Zagrebačka nadbiskupija, so the main Catholic institution
Mm-hmm.
in Zagreb in 15th century, and if you go and read the dialect is not even remotely similar to Croatian language nowadays, but it's similar to what we call nowadays prekmurština or prekmurje dialect. This is a part of Slovenia that's been historically somewhat connected to Hungary, for example. And what you could speculate is that these people both were under Hungarian Empire, uh, uh, at least in the extent or in some sort of connection to Hungarian culture, Hungarian language, or whatever. But to see this 15th century Bible from Zagrebačka nadbiskupia, you cannot pretend that Slovenes are Croatians. You can look at the formal Croatian language, um, and see the differences between 15th century language or dialect used in Zagrebačka nadbiskupia Bible, and you see that the Croatian language nowadays, and Slovene language nowadays, and Prekmurština nowadays, and you see that there are much more similarities to Slovene language and to Prekmurština. You cannot pretend in any sort of way that Slovenes are Croats, these northern Croats, and this is I would like to hear the arguments for it, but maybe you could say that the state pretensions, the imperial pretensions or to form a state or an empire by people who are identified as Croats is older, bigger, or something like that as the pretensions of people trying to identify or calling themselves as Slovenes. But genetically, linguistically, temperamentally, you cannot deny that these people are Slovenes.
There was a because it's interesting because the both, I mean, see, not even the both, the three, let's say the names of the three people, the Serbs, the Bulgarians, and Croats, are related with migration out of the Balkans. We're talking about the people that were how to say, the state building elements, the aristocrats, the nobility, things like that, and they were related with these steppe people. Now, in the case of the Croats and with the case of the Serbs, most likely in the case of Bulgarians, there are a lot of arguments about that, contrary to the modern thesis that is quite quite fake. But anyway, these people related with the Iranian horse riding elements, like Sarmatians and things like that, and there are arguments of that. Of course, this was the minority. These people melted in whatever the indigenous population was, Eastern Romans, Slovenes, things like that. And what the ancient or medieval history behind Slovenes? Do you are part of the Great Moravia, if I remember correctly, or I'm mistaken at some point?
Uh, I don't know. The first mentioned quasi Slovene quasi state sort of say, because I say quasi because these were not states or empires as we know them nowadays, was called Carantania.
Uh-huh.
And we some parts of modern day Slovenia were in some sort of bigger mm, bigger created empires or states or whatever, with Slovaks and Czechs, of course,
Uh-huh.
um, and even in the Austro-Hungarian Empire later on, we were basically like in the same empire. Mm. Also with the northern Croats, for example, uh, So uh, I don't know. I sorry. I forgot what was the exact
because
question.
because also I heard another claim from an Italian, which is kind of spurgy Italian anyway, but he was claiming that because you said he said Carinthia, right? Carinthia, they're totally Italians there. They're Slavinized Italians. The
Oh.
movies, and I said, I don't see how this could work, but yeah, this is what trying to say, that people are claiming a lot of things, but what is in reality, you can base
Yeah.
your nationalism on historical, anthropological, and cultural evidences stretching back to history. And if you have, and this that's why a lot of people, like, again, I'm sorry that say Macedonians, they're trying to stretch their history back in the time to look more to have more rightful claims to the land, but it's some point it sounds to be a little bit stupid, to be honest. And
Yeah. I agree. I totally agree. And it, as you said, continuity can be stretched into the past through genetics, through linguistics, through archaeology. But it's a complex notion, isn't it? You cannot say, for example, these were Bulgarians or these were Slovenes stretching the I don't know, some genetics data or linguistics data or archaeology data into the past solemnly. For example, you cannot reduce someone's identity if you try to objectively define some identity only to language or to genes or to archaeology, for example. The continuity has to be complex in the sense then that when you cannot withhold this complexity of the stretching it into the past anymore, you have to stop it and you have to rethink to which extent you can stretch it into the past, for example. That's why on one hand I'm against this oh, what are you trying to find a pure Slovene? No, I never use this language, but you have to have some standards of what is the nation that formed the Slovenian nation and Slovenian state in the 91 with the help of CIA and so forth. We were some type of nation, some sort of nation, some pile of peoples with some continuity, collective continuity, stretched into the past. And that's why we all ethno nationalists have to have discussions of this type on this. Maybe there are some nations that can stretch some of their data into the past with the whole complexity, and some not. It could be that some nations are quote unquote more clearly homogeneous ethnically. It could be. What do you think about this?
I think that some people will. So basically, it depends how successful your nation building elements were. Now we can go into the racial theory. You can say that some people were more aggressive, more organized back in the time, and some people were building empires. Some people had more success in the building empires based on some military advantages or cultural advantages. Some built influence through language, through culture, let's say Byzantines. I dare to say Bulgarians also built quite strong influence through based on culture back in the time. Some were more, I would say, closer to the term of pure like tribes, but even the tribes are not like pure. Like they're trying to portray it, for example, that the original Germans were 2 meters tall and blonde and black. No, they were not. They were different tribes. They are described by the Romans, and some people that are Nordicists, for example, they're picking one description. They say, oh, they were blonde and blue-eyed. All Germans must be like that. No, there were different tribes, most likely with different origin. They were Germanized through the language, but before that, they could be Celts. There were quite a lot of Celts. Exactly what we understand by Celtic culture is related to the Hallstatt culture. They most likely spoke some other language. They had a Roman influence. They had whatever Eastern, let's say, Slavic influence. Maybe even through the Balkans, they had Illyrian and Dacian and Thracian influence. Even they had some Scythian influence coming from the steppes. So these components coming together again, as I said, the ethno-nationalists must understand that you may not be like 100% purist, but you must have. I agree with you. Some kind of to draw the border. Let's say this is Bulgarian and this is Slovene and this is Albanian and this is German, right? Let's say 200 years. I say we can trace the things more or less 200 years back in the time and say, yes, this is Slovenes. Slovenia is for the Slovenians, obviously. Other people could come here and work as guests if they behave well. Some small percentage of them could stay and integrate if some people will return back home or whatever. This I understand you. I mean I agree with you 100%. Now the problem is that what we see right now is total replacement of the European population everywhere. Like even in America, they have the same process. In Russia, everywhere is the same problem. Basically, it's like genocidal, but peaceful process. Peaceful, relatively speaking. It's not exactly peaceful, but it's in larger terms is peaceful. Of replacement of the population. Of course, you can say that Negroes raping and Pakistanis raping little girls in Britain is not very peaceful. Negroes raping in America or Turks but you know what I mean. It's not like a large invasion and things like that. And what we will pass. So first, we must define who is who. What are our roots, so to say, historically, and to draw definition. And then we must start to build on these building components. We must start to build networking and to create something that was unseen of. Basically, ethno-nationalists starting to cooperate from different countries, because civic nationalists, they will always push this civic nationalism against each other, and because civic nationalism will always mutate in chauvinism. And the lack of understanding is, so you must understand who it's like a process of growing, of becoming wiser, so to say, on the personal level, to understand who you are, but also on the national level. What is your nation? What is your forefathers? What are the achievements of your fathers? For example, I was passing through Slovenia. It's a very nice country. It's very, I would say that it cannot pass for a Balkan country at all. It's more like Central European country. Croatia is also, it's not exactly, never been in Croatia, by the way. Just I was visiting Austria like 10 years ago and things like that. But Croatia, from what I see, is more like Adriatic country, maybe closer to Italy to some degree, but also with some Balkan and Austrian influence, and the Central European influence in Slovenia is very obvious. I mean, it's like Alpine country basically. Very clean, very pleasant
Yeah.
country. This is my impression of Slovenia, and from Slovenian people. As I said, I had student, I mean, co-students or whatever is called in English, from Slovenia. Very pleasant people, and I wouldn't put them in the same group as Bulgarians and Serbs, let's say, or Montenegrins. They're like like different. And
Would
I
you,
don't,
would,
but in the bad sense of the term, different.
yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Would you say?
s-
Would you say? I know you said that you were some sort of national socialist. Would you say
hmm.
that there's anything to to capitalism that differentiates Slovenia from other Balkans, or is it more about how these Central European, Northern European nations handle their things, and it's not necessary capitalism that they handle with. For example, it's more about how Germans and Austrians and Slovenes are temperamentally. It's not about how they trade or if they trade at all, because Slovenia, for example, is economically very dependent on Germany, Germany and Austria. Um, would you call this a free trade thing or capitalism thing, or would you find anything good about capitalism, for example, although it's obvious? We had this party in Slovenia, but it was called Domovinska Liga. So it's that was supposed to be ethno-nationalistic, but it also purported libertarianism, which was ludicrous to me. You cannot be a priori for free trade on anything, on work, on anything, if you're trying to be sovereign, isn't it so?
I would say that in capitalism, on the lower levels, before these before the birth of these capitalist monopolist giants on the top, on the low levels of the pyramids, there are a lot of good things. Even in countries, let's say like National Socialist Germany, they were emphasizing on the lower and mid-range. There were a lot of programs for example, for smaller shop owners, not so these big corporate giants and things like that. So on the low level it works quite well. I mean, if you want to buy something, it's good to have a lot of sources of to provide these things, so competition that would somehow compete between each other, and you can buy something on the best price. But on the high level you have these international banks, you have these international consortiums, these enormous trusts that started to dominate and to create their own politics, their own agendas, and they start to overrun the smaller countries. Because what is Slovenia or Bulgaria compared to, let's say, Pepsi, or with Texaco, or or even with Gazprom, the Russians? Nothing. Like, we are small countries compared to that. So on that level, definitely I see that the international capital is obviously destruction, is bringing destruction of the nations, which I think is the goal of these of the Jews, because this is what they want, like a total domination over the world. But again, on a small level, yes, free market, without speculation, if it's possible uh, to have a free market without speculation. Also, cheap credits for the smaller businesses, for the mid-range businesses, and trying to create some kind of class of people that are independent, because in my mind this is the backbone of countries, of free countries. And people that are independent, united around a common origin, around a common language, common history, common genetics. Uh, to some degree, I believe this is possible to obtain. But how a small countries could resist a larger empires, as you commented, how the smaller country could resist these globalist corporations. Now, that's why I said that at some point, a need for some kind of bigger geopolitical union without destruction of national states is needed. So, in some degree, you can say that I agree with the geopolitical and economical goals of Europe or European Union without agreeing with their ethno-genocidal policies or culture, anti-European cultural policies. So call them as you want, but basically you know what I mean. I agree that it's much better in the European Union when it's peaceful, when people could trade, could travel freely, and work to some degree. As said, I will put limitation, especially in the case of small countries like Slovenia, Denmark, Bulgaria. If 3 millions, I don't know, Albanians came to Bulgaria, it will be the same problem like in Slovenia, right, or in Denmark. Uh, but also you must recognize that we cannot compete with Russia, we cannot compete with China, we cannot compete with America alone. We need a greater geopolitical unions. Europe is, even though the anthropological and cultural difference between the north and the south and the east and the west, Europe is the closest thing that we have as a geopolitical entity. And unfortunately, Europe as a geopolitical entity right now is quite weak. They don't have the look what happened in with Ukraine and the different cracks in the west and the east. And I would say that the Eastern Europeans are more pro-Ukrainian than Western Europeans, because they are more like they want to push their own economical interest. And I believe that they're spoiled by the luxurious lives that they had for quite a long period of time. And they don't understand the nationalism of Ukrainians, they don't understand their struggles. Meanwhile, I can understand why they're doing that. And I think that this split between East and Western Europe is pushed again from the two opposing sides that are enemies of Europe. One is the Atlanticist or the Anglosphere bloc, and the other the Russo-Eurasianist bloc. So for me, Europe must be united economically and military even. European army must be created. Europeans must start to implement and to develop their own technologies, and we must look at the uh, Lebensraum, as you said, and to look at some kind new form of, it will sound bad, but basically neo-colonialism, including obtaining independent sources of important resources without importing enormous non-European population in Europe, which is
But
basically
but, but
which is
I
basic
agree with you.
which is basically the main goal of the present European utopianists, that they want to replace steadily the Europeans with Arabs, with Northern Africans, with Middle Easterners, with Negroes, and to create some kind of neo-Roman hodgepodge, basically. And if the Russians take over, they will create the Eurasianist model, in which a large a large population of from Mongoloid origin will be pushed into Europe. So
But okay, I have to admit I like the Mongols more than the niggers.
I don't
They
think
have
that you
they have at least
you
they have
like.
smaller dick. They have smaller dicks. They have small. I'm joking. I'm joking. They are not a threat to me as a man. I'm
Okay,
joking. I'm
okay,
joking.
okay. But to be honest, this is the only version for Europe to survive is a rising of the ethno-nationalists in different countries that will, strangely as it sounds, that started to cooperate with other ethno-nationalists in Europe. So civic nationalism is pushing a national propaganda, is pushing chauvinism. Ethno-nationalism is like understanding of who is who, and on this understanding having a beneficial relations with other people that are closer to you. I mean, why we must, how to say, why we must adopt some kind of Eurasianism when Eurasianism is anti-European on an ethnic and cultural level? Why we must adopt Atlanticism, what is Atlanticism is against Europeans on an ethnic, racial, and cultural level? And you must understand me also. I don't have, for example, some people say, "Oh, the Albanians are Muslims or Bosniaks are Muslims." Well, yeah, yeah, but they're Europeans. I mean, if they're in their own country and they're Muslims, I don't have problems with them, right? If they become how to say, if they're spreading radical, mostly I'm talking mostly for the Bosniaks, if they're spreading radical Islam, it's like it's a problem, right?
Yeah, I
So
do agree about the radical Islam, but it seems it's also part of the narrative. Uh, One thing is radical Islam, whatever that is. Wouldn't you say that a lot of radical Islamist attacks in Europe could be interpreted, or at least it could be speculated about them as psyops of Jewish-led intelligence, just to promote or to mask the real problems. Because, okay, it might be that Germans have real problems with Islamists because they have so many Middle Eastern Muslims that came there. Slovenia does not have so many. So the majority of our Muslims are Bosniaks, basically, Bosniaks were basically the most secularized ethnic group in ex-Yugoslavia. Maybe they have been Turkicized or Muslimized a little bit after the war, but yeah, I would like to say that I mean, uh, our right wingers, our mainstream right wingers would often um, get political points from naive people just by saying we have to stop radical Islam and so forth and so forth. It's against our values. And when you ask them what are our values, you soon come to the answer that our values are libertine values, although they sometimes call them Christian values or Western
mm,
values,
mm,
which are basically no values at all. And in the sense of some social problems we Europeans have, or the Westerns have, it seems that Muslims are not that bad if you compare them to Western libertines. What would you say about that?
there were no standards. I mean, the modern standards. What are the standards? You must not be anti-Semite because this is the worse than Satanist and whatever. It's worse than pedophilia, basically, to be anti-Semite. You must not be a racist. And what else? These are the only taboos. You must be not a Nazi, right? and you must like homosexuals, degenerates. Still, there is some uh, social hatred against the pedophiles, but through extensive propaganda of Hollywood, for example, this could be erased in the future generations, right? Race mixing is large part of the propaganda. What else? Liberal values, right? All kinds of liberal values, like large part of propaganda is veganism. What else? I don't see. So basically, everything that is like nation building and race building and family building is destroyed. So it's total annihilation of everything. So basically, the perfect creation of in the next generation is B or three ratio, uh, multisexual or fluent sexual, whatever they use, creature, and after one more generation, there will be multi-species thing because they will implement genetic modifications most likely and these transhumanist thing. And you
Yeah.
must understand me correctly. I'm not a Christian, but some of the values that we must defend are basic values of a common sense. They will be the same for pagan Rome. They will be the same for pagan Greece. They will be the same for the pagan Germans. They will be the same for Catholics. They will be the same for the Orthodox. They will be the same for the Protestants. They will basically the same. The very normal values. We must build from the basics. There are men and there are women. Do we need a healthy man and feminine women that are raised as mothers of children, and men that are strong and capable enough to defend their families and to feed their families? This is quite strong basic for every common sense. On the base of that, you must understand the differences between the different races and different sub races. Good. If you understand these differences, you must start to understand the difference between different cultures and different cultural groups. You must understand the different religion groups and things like that. And on the basis of that, as I said, going from the greater truth to the smaller truth, you can rebuild society and restore society. And again, I will say that I'm not conservative in a sense. Let's go to the values that were appropriate in the year 1000. We must take the traditional values. You must take the spirit and the culture and tradition that were eternal, so to say, and to develop them to be able to survive in the future. But I don't think that developing means to eradicate everything. I think that the biological sexes are two, which obvious, and you have degenerates. You have degenerates, people
Yeah.
with mental diseases, biological problems. And there was a whole another thing to say. It's maybe we must look at the positive eugenics, how to prevent a lot of disease, and how to implement a healthy sexual relations between the sexes to create these healthy families in the future, not these strange uh, sexual depravity that is propagandized by the media. And by doing so, we will take the talking points of these kosher nationalists or civic nationalists that are mostly financed by the East. So that's why I'm for the third way, the Europe for the Europeans, Europe of the nations, Europe as a rainbow, but not as a LGBT rainbow, a rainbow of a strong, independent, normal people built around their common origin, relatively similar cultures, relatively, because of course I wouldn't compare Bulgarians with Danes or Danes with French or French with Slovenes. Obviously, their beauty in difference, but beauty in how to say, it's like talking with you, I'm talking with something like the genetic equivalent of a third or fourth cousin. Talking with Arab or Turk is something like genetic equivalent of I don't know what, the totally different people. That's why Europe as a, I'm not for Europe as a national identity for this creating a hodgepodge. I am for, maybe this will come to some point after 500 years or 1,000 years.
But how to do it? How to do it? I mean, we probably agree that our mainstream politicians, the politicians that have all the assets, they have the media, they have so they have the upper hand on a normie. They have the armies, they have police, they have the courtrooms, they have the judges, they have the lawyers, they have everything, and they have been installed as our quasi leaders by foreigners. We would probably agree that the majority of European leaders are installed by the Judeo American
Hmm.
um,
Hmm.
globalists. What, how to get rid of them? How to install our sincere leaders that are for that would be for our people, not for the tribe.
I think that I think that the America as a global power depends on, of course, the extremely strong military and quite strong national currency that is enforced in the world. Right? We must agree with that. And of course, their cultural influence is based on the mass propaganda of Hollywood, the mass propaganda through internet. And But what will happen if the people that built this strong economy and this strong military are replaced, and they are being replaced in that moment? They're being replaced by Mexicans, by Negroids, by these Homo futuricus, raceless people, by people with fluid genders, with all these strange mutants. What will happen? I don't think that only the strong geopolitical position of America, which is like unsinkable jet carrier in the middle between Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, is enough to sustain this empire. I think that the replacement of the population will cause enormous problem for the Americans, and the coming clash with China wouldn't be merciful for their world dominion position. That's why I ask my American friends that all American nationalists or white nationalists, whatever they call themselves, they are against America. I hate America. I hate America. I'm 80% German and 15% Celtic or whatever. Uh, but they don't identify it as America. But the if America falls from grace, falls from power, they will retreat from Europe. And then these liberal governments, these guardians of the liberal power, they will be destabilized. That's why the Russians are betting on that. That's why they want to establish their dominion, which is also not desirable, over Eastern Europe, at least on Eastern Europe, in that period. They want to destabilize Europe, they want to destabilize the United States, but they don't have, I don't think that they have the means, and I don't think that they have the attractive idea, not to mention that their idea, a multipolar world, is created by Jew. It's called Primakov doctrine. And and there are a lot of Jews around Putin too. Not to mention his very fishy origin. But anyway, so this is what I think, that America at some point will retreat from Europe, and America knows it too. That's why they want to create these Eastern Bloc, the split in Europe in East and West, because they want to establish their cultural dominance over one part of Europe. And this is where our moment is coming. Basically, we must have the arguments, we must convince our countrymen at first, and we must start to build this connection that we're talking about between the different groups in Europe that are racially aware or ethno-nationalists, call them as you want. And yeah, I think that,
Okay, okay. We've been for 2 hours and
yeah,
20 minutes
yeah, yeah.
long, and I promise you we will be 45 minutes to an hour. So I hope we get to comment on many other issues in the future. I hope we can make many similar streams. I would really have a humble request. You said that you can connect me to the Albanian ethno nationalist. That
Yep.
would be really nice. Maybe we can also have some some stream together. All of three. Maybe we can have some streams with our South African friends and so forth. Thank you for coming today. Thank you for all your information, for all your mm, intelligence and so forth. And any final thoughts?
I think that the our time is coming. A big social and unfortunately racial changes are coming to Europe. Uh, a struggle between Atlanticists and Eurasianists could bring the freedom of Europe. If we play our cards good enough, it will be Europe for the ethnic Europeans, culturally and racially, and not for dominion of the raceless, cultureless tribes of Goyim that will be subjugated by the high-tech messianic types that we didn't talk about them, but basically this is their end game: destruction of Europe, destruction of the Europeans, including in America, including in Russia, and establishing dominion over the world in some kind of ethno, how to say, neo occult utopia, like the messianic type. So I think that we can overcome these types and establish our model, which will be Europe for the Europeans and Europe of the nations.
Okay, with this final thought, I thank all the viewers, all the people that commented. Thank you for everything, and thank you, NORDLUX. I hope we can meet and make another stream very soon.
Thank you, and I'll be happy to provide you with connections with Albanian and Croatians. Actually, a Croatian nationalist is coming to visit me in person in the next week or so. So maybe I will record some of our thoughts, and I hope that maybe we'll build some contrary to the stories about Balkaniers fighting each other for eternity. We will build some connections, and yeah,
Yeah, thank you. See you. Good
bye
night.
bye.
Bye bye.